Hello and welcome to the Forgeborn Finishing School. Casey, Kid, and Core here. We'll be analyzing Forgeborn battles to help take your game to the next level.
Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode here. Casey, Kid, and Core. Just going to get into the Digitize update a little bit before we get into really the meat of this episode because we've got a really exciting episode. So just really quick, Digitize Dustup is finishing up. Again, we'll be doing that wrap-up video if you haven't seen it already. One thing I do want to say, we've got all the prizes in, Core. I know we thought one would be a little bit behind schedule maybe. Super excited to get these in the mail. These should be in the mail by the time you're watching this video. So hopefully everything goes smooth there. I did throw return addresses on them. I've had some snafus in the past, so got that figured out. And then, to talk about this episode as we get into it a little bit, we are going to have a spoiler and another big reveal. So you're going to want to hang on for the very end of this episode because we're going to have something really exciting to show you. But Greg, any last comments on the Digitize Dustup?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks again to the entire community, all the content creators, all the players, everybody that has helped and contributed to this event. The support was just outstanding. I mean, we stretched our goal and then we stretched it even further. I mean, it was just awesome, and so a heartfelt thank you to everybody. It was really awesome. With that, though, we do have a very special guest with us today, and I'd like to introduce George, the creative director for Stoneblade Entertainment. And so for, all of us, SoulsForge players or enthusiasts of Stoneblade products, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your current and past work?
Yeah, I mean, Stoneblade is the first company that I've worked for regarding gaming. But games have always been a huge part of my history, whether it be historical war games I grew up on, and Warhammer, and tabletop role playing. Most importantly, I actually was never. I never really spent a lot of time with collectible card games as a kid. Mostly just role playing and tabletop war games. But yeah, I have. It's been the best job I've ever had. It's so much fun, and I really enjoy getting to make stuff up for a living.
That's awesome. That sounds like an amazing job being able to create these stories and have players be able to read those and interact with them, and also in some ways help influence that potentially with some of the storyline events that you're putting on. It's just been a really great experience from it, and that's awesome to hear, as well as kind of the background of your gaming and bringing that in there. I think there's a lot of points you can bring with that. We got some more questions for you, but Ryan alluded to we're going to have one spoiler here, and we're going to have a major one towards the end of it. So we're going to go ahead and pop off the next spoiler, and we'd like to get. I think this will be the first time Ryan has seen it, and so we get Ryan's immediate feedback on the card, and then George, we're probably going to ask you some of your thoughts on this card as well, and I might or may not share my thoughts. So go ahead, Ryan.
All right, here we go. Spoiler. Yeah, it's looks like the Spirit Steel Infiltrator in Aloyan, mobility and aggressive. I really like that. And here we have the same theme with spirits bleeding into the other factions. So we have an Aloyan spirit. Looks a little Tron-esque maybe. The stat line is something that you would assume would align with being an aggressive creature. But then it has the ability, when this deals damage to an enemy player, you may give an enemy creature -2. This goes up by 2 at each subsequent step or level. So 2, 4, 6. I think this is very cool. You can slide out of the opponent's way, kind of dip, duck, dodge, and dive, and dodge right past the enemy, and then hit the opponent, and then reduce that incoming threat that you just moved out of the way of. So it's very interesting. I think the stat line's acceptable. I mean, to be at a potentially competitive level, 5'3", 8'4", 10'5", for that mobility and aggressive, this is like a high likelihood that you're going to connect with this creature very often. So I like it. I think it's very cool.
Yeah, I like to see that the aggressive makes up for it in the lower health departments to be able to drop this on a non, when you're off Forge. But George, do you have any thoughts on this card from a art, lore, or gameplay perspective?
I mean, I think we have to work Spirit Steel into the game more heavily. It's a crazy technology that the Alloyan have developed. Yeah, as I was saying, like a lot of the art comes from the original Soulforge, and so there's so much art, and so I don't know. I love to kind of see how sometimes it's used, because it'll sometimes get pulled out and used for the cards when the kind of development team comes up with something for it, and it may not actually pass through me. I work on developing all of the new art for the game, so when there's a missing piece, something that we just don't have any reference for, I'll start to develop that piece. But there's so much art that I'm often finding like new things and going, oh wow, we need to use this. But this is really cool. I like the idea of like a Spirit Steel being able to make you like phase through. The fact that there's like an infiltrator, this character might be able to like phase through walls with full armor on. That's why they're infiltrators. Spirit Steel, maybe it's like some sort of ethereal metal, which sounds ridiculous and amazing.
Yeah, I think you guys, both of you called out like the spirit on there. I think it's really awesome to see more spirits. I kind of like that as a sub faction. I'm glad to seeing it getting more playthrough. And then just thinking back to like some of the things in previous sets you could pair this with. There's the Necrium card, Exalt in set 2 that can allow this to get stealth, which would be huge. And then even in Utera, playing this with the Shard King, another Exalt that then would allow this to get breakthrough, being able to further use this bottom ability. So, and the artwork looks great on this card for what it does. You kind of, put it out there. That's, another great example.
Well, just also the question of like, how do you incorporate the concept of a spirit into the Alloyan, as the Alloyan are like a technological people, like a kind of science-based people. So you have this idea of like this spirits running around, and how do you incorporate that? And I like the idea that it's almost metaphorical rather than literal.
Yeah, almost like they're infusing spirits of past warriors into their machine robots.
Yeah. or it's just like a clever code name for the weapon they've developed.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
I think that the spirits, I mean, before when we started, spoiling spirit cards, I thought, well, it probably won't be that powerful, but now with spirits in every single faction more and more and more, this could be one of the dominant tribal factions in the game. So it's very interesting to see these keep rolling out. And I'm excited for this set. It's going to be a blast.
So George, going into some of the questions, I have some questions for you. Just kind of like in regards to, writing and planning, this world, this game environment, or this mythos of the world, like what are other stories or history elements? You're talking about historic gaming and Warhammer RPGs and stuff. What are elements from that past experience have created inspiration for you, or things that you've drawn, ideas or inspiration from?
So I guess the way to think of the story for Soulforge, and it makes it difficult to answer specifically where the inspiration comes from. The story with Soulforge is less of a storyline and more of a story landscape, if that makes sense. We were referring to it when we started developing it as anthropological storytelling. And what that means is that if you imagine like a dig site where you're finding pieces and layers, and all of this information in this little dig site can tell you so much about the group of people that live there. And in the same way with the storytelling we're doing here, we're essentially like looking at the pieces of lore that develop through play and through our tournaments, and a variety of new ways that we're going to have involved when Soulforge Fusion Digital comes out, and every set that progresses the story forward. we're adding more and more details to the world and piecing together a variety of narratives within that world. And so I would say that the inspiration probably comes mostly from one of my best friends who worked in anthropology for a million years. Because we spent a lot of time talking about story, but from that perspective. That was always the language we used. And so working on card games and having to tell stories through card games, each card is like a fragment of a story. And so when you put the two pieces next to each other, you start to see a new story, right? I think it's called closure, like in the way comic books work, where you put two panels next to each other and then your imagination fills in the space between. So in a similar way, we're kind of doing that with cards, right? If I put this new Spirit Steel Infiltrator next to a zombie, there's suddenly a story in your head, right? like what happens next and what's happening between those two cards is up to your imagination and the way it interprets that information. And I think the whole world, the whole story of Soulforge is developed that way. There are plot points because there are mechanics that are involved with future sets, but overall, what we're looking at is a landscape of story, and everybody piecing together that story the way they want to interpret it. So I think there's some fun stuff. I can dig into that a little bit more, but if I start going down that road, I'm never going to stop.
No, that's really interesting. You're talking about kind of like the history and things from here in our time as we look back and historically, and as you mentioned, the dig sites and ancient cultures and how we how we each interpret those discoveries as to say this is how they lived or this is what we did. I think it's a very interesting concept, especially when you're looking at like the bottom of every these of the Forgeborn, the cards, you got these texts at the bottom, and they kind of allude to different things.
Well, and that's the idea, right? The texts that are at the bottom of the cards, and I don't think everyone that plays knows this, but we have the 3 levels of the cards, right? And so when we were first developing the game, there was a question of, well, how do we make flavor text for this? And I was tasked with creating the flavor text for it. And so several weeks before it came out, after I had written a ton of flavor text that was like more specific to the lore, and it was kind of objective, like this happened. I realized that using the 3 lines, we could make haikus for everything, which was a brutal task of writing about 280 haikus in 2 weeks. Just like a poetry marathon. But it was fun and interesting, and just a whole other way of thinking about storytelling. But I think it adds to the idea that when we're telling the story in Soulforge, we're not trying to tell you the objective story, like from third person, like here's what happened. We're trying to tell you the story just as you're learning it. We're writing it the same way. I'm privileged with extra information because I'm the creative director, but I'm also piecing it together from all of the events that everyone's playing in. So often I'm as surprised with what happened in the story as a lot of people are, because I'm that when we do a tournament, I sit right next to everyone and I ask them what's happening and I write the story while I'm there. Or in some cases, just while I'm talking to Alex while a tournament is going on somewhere else in the world. But it's all being written based on what's happening, which is another marathon writing style that we have to kind of do with this game. But what we attempt to do is tell it from a character's point of view. That way, the narrator can always be wrong. And that way it allows you to buy into different ideologies and mindsets from the characters that you love. So if you love playing Circe, you might just love Circe's propaganda,
Yep.
And there are certainly elements of the history that she knows because, she might have access to ancient lore that the Eloyan don't have, and the Eloyan might have access to lore that she doesn't have. And so in that situation, they all have fragments of a truth. And I think that's what makes the lore really fun, is that at a certain point, it will grow to a place where a lot of the players who've been in it for a long time will have their own versions of the history of the world. And to some extent, they'll all be right and wrong, which I love. It's just a really interesting way of writing a story for a game, but it works so well when it's cards.
Well, it's really good correlation too to like real world, right? There's superpowers and then other powers in the world, but they all have their own version of history and events and perspectives. So I think that's a great way to go about it. One thing I did want to bring back to really quick is you're mentioning the haikus. I think that's a really great story. And one thing that I absolutely love that Stoneblade has done is it's just another avenue for player interaction. Because already in set 2, we have some players who submitted haikus to be on cards and then have those haikus on cards. So they're out there looking for those cards to try to collect something that's just a piece of the story they put in. So really, like Soulforge Fusions, one of its biggest things is player interaction, and it's amazing that you can have not just a storyline event, but you can have haiku submissions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think collective storytelling is so incredibly powerful, and we see that in role-playing games. And from the stories I've heard, I was never part of it, but Legend of the Five Rings was supposed to be another like a world of card gaming where there was like a whole entire like fan base that brought all the lore to life. And it's I was certainly talking about inspirations earlier. That was one of them. All the stories I heard from Justin and all of the people who've ever mentioned it to me, I'm like jealous that I didn't get to be part of that, but I'm happy that I get to be part of the Soulforge Fusion one.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the what I love about Soulforge Fusion is this creative direction on like storytelling and how players can have an impact on it. Because I was a huge L5R player back in the day, and driving to tournaments, we'd carpool to tournaments across the U.S. and play games to try to help impact the storyline. And so one of the, for Soulforge Fusion, one of the storylines or context, that it intrigues me. And so since I have you here, I'm going to ask you. But in the storyline, the context of the game, the Forge plays a central like dominance for the factions. And so I'm really just curious about the references we see to the Dark Forge. Like, is this Blight related? Particularly because, I've had success with Thoros, and I've just kind of, read his cards naturally. And so, like, there's a lot of references to the Dark Forge on his flavor text. So is there anything you're able to share on this, or, maybe some insight or spoilers you can provide?
I would say if there hasn't been anything written about it yet, other than that, then that's all the information there is. I'm not. That's not me trying to like get out of talking about anything like that. It's the nature of the way we write the story, right? And so part of the way we write the story and we write the game is some of the mechanics will be left open without the layer of lore on top of it until we find the right layer of lore to go on top of it, right? So we kind of know like how the game will be played, and then at a certain point we have to make decisions on, well, what does this mechanic now look like with lore on top of it? So I don't want to like what the way that I always look at the lore is to say what is in the world, and how can we draw from what's in the world? Because again, I like playing the game with the fans, where it's like we're in this role-playing game together, this big gigantic role-playing game together, where like here are the bits of information that are out there, and so if there's some mention of the Dark Forge, what it is hasn't been revealed yet. Its connection to the Blight, if there is any, hasn't been revealed yet. All we know is that Oros, right, it's on Oros's card. I believe it's like one ability on his card, and then is there flavor text with it? I think it's just the ability, right?
Quite a bit of his cards have different flavor text alluding to this Dark Forge. There's like 3 or 4 of them, and it's great. So,
So I would say one way to find out more is to dig, and to dig means to play at a tournament and ask questions about it, or mention stuff as you're playing. like, again, like I want people to interact in a way that it feels like there's a bit of role playing to it. So when you come to an event, if there's a part of the world that you love, write a piece of lore about it, make a speech about it, do a thing. And it will be hard for me to like ignore the fact that you're participating so heavily in the lore. And that's generally how something like that would probably get added. Again, like it's up to the discretion of the team, but that's the point of that's kind of how I draw it. When someone tells me a great story at one of the events about like a deck or something, and they involve a piece of lore that I initially hadn't thought much about, I try to then begin to tie it into the main storyline. So, the fact that not a lot of people have mentioned the Dark Forge, even though the concept is in the Oros cards, is simply why it hasn't been written about much. It's really like, dig for the story that you want.
All right, everybody.
I'm gonna take some moments to dig here, if that's all right, Greg.
Let's do it.
All right.
So I'm gonna jump over to talk about Crux a little bit, and so Oros now through the storyline has been taken over by the Blight, or has come to a pact with the Blight. We're not really fully sure of the occurrence there, but either way, he's blighted or exalted in the terms that we know, and so. With the flavor text of Oros's cards, I think Greg and I believe that he has been influenced by the Blight previously, far before we found out that he's now blighted. And so, with that being said, we also look at the PAX. I think it was Origins event with Crux coming out, and part of his storyline was that he was thrown into a pit, and that pit was lined with Oros's mycelium network. And so just kind of tying this all together, if at that time in Crux Rebirth, Oros was already in a pact or an agreement or was receiving power or aid from the Blight that his allies didn't know about, and he, in fact, didn't want them to know about as part of the flavor text. I think it's very interesting that Crux might already be impacted or infected with the Blight, and we don't know it, which also, in my opinion, leads a little bit into his hive mind theory. So there's just a couple of things that I've been putting together, reading through the lore.
I love this. This is so fun. Okay, so the mycelial network and mycelial magic was developed by one of the other person that I write the lore with, V.S. Holmes, who's an awesome writer who everyone should check out. They also work in anthropology. So I think in one of the first pieces of deck lore, they wrote about the mycelial network and the hint of the Blight, which was really interesting because fans came up with the term the Blight separately from V.S. Holmes coming up with the term the Blight. They actually like emerged at the same time. It was really strange. And we were like, okay, well, that's a thing, and so the mycelial network in that story, if I recall it right, it's simply a network of communication by which the Eutera, like it's just like a communication network for the Eutera. Essentially, the mycelial network, since they live underground, is a great way for them to get messages from one place to another. And what they call mycelial magic is essentially the ability to use the phone, right? I think they can transfer more information than that, but we haven't seen really evidence of it. I believe in that story, the Blight is somehow affecting it. So I can see the connection you've made, although it's unclear whether that's actually affected him or not. And it could be that the mycelial network was more evidence of the hive concept that he liked, or that it was the genesis of the concept. But again, we haven't seen either. So it's really interesting. I like that theory.
Yeah, after it was Greg started talking about the Dark Forge, and that's what got us to dig into lore. That led to our first lore episode. And then we had great conversations with you down in Indiana. So
well, it's so funny because it's like it's the more, because we have the deck lore, and then we have the lore for the events, and then we have like the all of the flavor text. And so like at a certain point, I'm trying to remember like more history than I actually know about the real world that I live in.
Yeah.
And even I'm gonna eventually start to like the I'm not be able to contain all of the information, which I think will actually be really fun. Because again, like that, like what you said about Crux is fascinating and a really interesting concept. So I love when this stuff happens. It's like the coolest thing to me to see how people put pieces together. Because it's just I don't know, it's just a really fun project. I really like seeing how people are creative and how they puzzle this stuff together. So it's fascinating. But yeah, I mean, the mycelial network is a really interesting thing, and that was VS Holmes's idea, and I thought it was so cool.
Awesome. Well, and you mentioned it's the landscape that you guys created that allows us to kind of just go find the little pieces, the little nuggets of information, and start theorizing in our heads, which is a ton of fun for us as well. But
yeah,
one of those other pieces that has just always kind of claimed a piece of my mind, and it is because I do like Circe's story and kind of follow along with hers pretty strongly. And so in the PAX event, we learned about the Forgotten as part of the storyline event. And I think we've started to learn that as the World of Solace thaws, all of the entities that were frozen there and coming out were labeled as the Forgotten, which seems to me like a pretty strong power that Circe can tap into. So can you just speak to those a little bit?
Yeah. I think the Forgotten is the term that the Necrium use for there's this idea that the world froze over at some point, right? The according to Korok's History of the World, which is the first video we put out, it's Korok speaking. There was a time when the Soul Forge was ignited, and then after that, the world froze. So kind of a literal kind of magical nuclear winter, I suppose. And so the Forgotten are from my perspective, the uncountable dead from that like initial freezing of the world. And so there's just so many people that kind of went down in that like kind of catastrophic event that they're labeled by the Necrium as the Forgotten. It's probably like a layer of ground. A terrifying layer of ground. But yeah, we haven't seen the undead tap into. We haven't seen the Necrium tap into them yet. But certainly, you can imagine what that would be like.
Perfect. I'm excited to see it. One last one that kind of goes into, I think, we're talking about the world thawing, and these exalts, these places of power are coming back into the world, it seems. And so, a couple of exalts we've now seen are items and or weapons or artifacts. And this has just kind of thrown me for a loop. So I envisioned the White Fang Pass as the first exalt we got used to, as just monolithic, huge pieces of landscape, places of power. But they can also be artifacts or things you can wield.
Sure, and I mean, as we saw with the new released cards, the Forgeborn are called Exalted, and the new ones, right? If you saw the Sunder card and with the dark the Blight.
Right,
Dark
and so the
Auras.
Exalted means they're essentially drawing power from an Exalt. Like when a creature's in an Exalt lane, it's Exalted. It's drawing power from an Exalt. But
I can tell you the way I envision them is that they're so the energy of the Soul Forge exists throughout the world. That saturates everything, right? And so the exalts are simply places where the energy or magic of the Soul Forge is pooled. And at first it seems like places, because places are big and take up space. But as it turns out, like items and people can be saturated with this energy as well. So I think of it like when I saw the first of the cards that had the items in them, I thought of it as let's say I had like a giant like temple to something, and then there was a ceremonial blade that was like left on the altar in that place when whatever catastrophic thing happened that froze the world, and that Soulforge energy started saturating everything. And so then within that temple, which is an exalt in itself, the ceremonial dagger sitting on the altar has also been saturated with a tremendous amount of energy, thereby becoming unintentionally a magic item, but also an exalted one. And so the idea of like a person becoming exalted as well is a similar situation. If Forgeborn in theory are like these kind of like they're kind of like magnets for the energy of the soul forge, then an exalted one might be one who has more power, or has absorbed a tremendous amount of that energy, even though they already have a tremendous amount of that energy. You're able to wield it.
Well,
Does that make sense?
Well, that's interesting because now you have like Oros and Sunder who are exalted, but they're also considered blighted by everybody. So does that mean that that the Soul Forge has infused them with more power, or is there another forge?
Certainly leaves a lot of questions, doesn't it?
And that's the fun thing about it, right? You looking at it and it'd be really interesting to see where the story goes from here.
Yeah. It's a built-in energy time. I love it. Super fun.
All right, I think this is a great point, Greg. If you want to lead us into discussing your likeness on a card.
Yeah, so I think we get a spoil it. Yeah, here we go. So the process was pretty straightforward. Here we see the artwork that will be on a card in a future set. So I mean the process was pretty, like I said, straightforward. If you get one of these opportunities, you'll get an email, or you'll reach out to you for an email address to send a link to, and in that link you put different things like what type of creature do you want to type, to be, human, druid, or dragon, things of that nature. Do you want it to be a likeness of you? What are some of your thoughts on what the card design should look like? And you can even offer different submissions of art that you want to maybe have the artist draw some inspiration from. And so for me, I thought it would be pretty neat to have some kind of like druidic knight. And so in my head, I was thinking if anybody played Warhammer Fantasy, they would know of the Green Knight from Bretonia. So that was part of that I asked them to draw inspiration from, as long as anybody from read Dragonlance novels, Sturm Brightblade in there as well.
Yeah.
And part of the Sturm Brightblade thing came about because when I was playing at Indy in the first Ultimate Championship, I was wearing a mustache at the time, and it wasn't the full horseshoe mustache that the card necessarily had, but it was working towards there. And somebody was like, "Well, if you win this, you gotta have a mustache because you're wearing one now." And I don't know if there's a mustache on a card. So I was like, "All right, let's do it." So that helped also drive the keeping the mustache on there. And so then at Gen Con, I tried growing out as best I could, but did not do Sturm Brightblade probably justice on it. But so it was really awesome. And then you're putting in the elements, the druidic and the vines. Part of my description was vines would be leaping out of the sword, striking, kind of that Utera concept. You also get to choose the faction that you want the card to be. I chose Utera since I was playing Oros. And then, I've always had this thought in my head, Ryan, I think, is one of the best players. So I'd envision at some point he would get an opportunity to design a card as well. And so I was like, talking about how there would be a Necroium force opposing the Utera force. And so that was kind of the design almost I went into it. And so, hopefully we'll see some of those as well on this next spoiler. So I'll let you take it away, Ryan.
So we can jump right over to mine. One thing I do want to say, if you win an Ultimate Championship, you get your likeness on a card. But it also turns out if you have the fortune of getting second in an Ultimate Championship to someone who's already won an Ultimate Championship, then you also get your likeness on a card. So the honor passed down to me after I fought Greg in the finals twice. Both games came down to the very last turns. Essentially, it was very, very close, those two matches. But it led to the creation of this card, and just as Greg said, very similar process. I was able to submit kind of my, influences, and two influences that I submitted. If anyone has read some of the old Malice Darkblade novels, that was one of the ones I really liked, his armor that he was always wearing. And so that was a big one for me. And then the other one is my favorite novel series of all time. It's called Malazan, Book of the Fallen. And it's a very complex story that was built from a couple of people that did Dungeons and Dragons and world building there. They created this amazing, rich, in-depth world. And so then later went and started writing novels about it. And one of the characters in there, Anamander Rake, has a sword that is always leaking smoke and has chains. And so that was one of my inspirations I submitted as well. And so I think you can see both of those represented in this card pretty heavily, which is very cool. But the coolest part, was what Greg alluded to before, was that he had his card originally designed from Indiana, fighting the Necrium pairing. And then I was able to, essentially mirror some of the language Greg used and worked with George to create, the other side of this battle, essentially. And one of my favorite parts, I'm going to flip back over to Greg's art here, is that in the back they have this this necromancer, Necrium sorcerer, kind of sneaking up on Greg's character here, which is great. And then if you look closely in my card, this is one of the bits that got snuck in there. You see the same necromancer kind of in my forces getting ready to battle. I'm not sure how we'll fare. You do have the King Rex over there, which is a little daunting, but yeah.
I mean, the Necrium has a lot of invisible stuff, so I wouldn't be so sure that there aren't terrifying things just hiding in the shadows.
Very good point. Very good point. But no, I remember, it's very, very awesome when, you get to work hand in hand with George and talk about like what you want to see kind of, and then they create it and you get this rough sketch, and then you get to, just have subtle changes. And, when it was given to me, George, I was like, I don't even know what to recommend. That's amazing. But I could tell you, I love that dinosaur back there. That's a must keep.
Yeah.
So just turned out awesome. I mean,
yeah, well, the art process is fairly simple for us. I like to keep it very streamlined, and I think it helps make it not tedious for the artist, while at the same time being a fun. I think there are some. How do I put this? I see the job of art direction as the alchemy between the person handing off the idea and the artist, and what comes out is generally pretty amazing. And so the process that we go through, that you've now been through, is basically a sketch phase, a rough color phase, and a polish phase. And as you go through each phase, there are less and less edits that I will be willing to ask an artist to make, unless there's something that's dramatic that drastically needs to be changed. But it's very unlikely, because we know the process and we go through it so much. And that keeps it to a simple 3 phases. It means we're not going to burden the artist with an unlimited number of alterations to a piece. And it helps us kind of just like keep everything in order. And so you saw that process, right? I sent you 2 or 3 sketches, depending on the artist. Some artists will hand in 2 sketches, some artists will hand in 3. But I think these cards were both done by Rod Mendez, who's awesome. And he would send 3 sketches, and then we would, pass them on to you. You'd tell me which things you liked and which things you didn't. And we could make pretty dramatic changes there, because it's just a sketch phase. And from there, then we go into the color placement, and we can make less changes, because now the like lines are kind of more heavily put in, and because it's digital, we can still shift some stuff around. And then finally, the polish phase, where you're just making like small changes. I think the funniest change was that that the character here on the screen had hair, and because the picture that I had was with a hat, so I had no idea. And yeah, you sent me a picture of what's his name? Sturm Brightblade, who has like the same mustache and hair. So so I was like, oh, okay, that's what this character has. And then you're like, no hair, and I was like, okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
An easy change. It's like the easiest change you could possibly make, going from hair to no hair. But it was really funny. Yeah, I don't know. I like that you both had Warhammer references. I thought you had both kind of separate. I think with the Necreum character, you both need to give names to these characters, first of all. Because we need to call them something.
I did not know that was part of our prerogative.
That's even more awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was. I mean, it wasn't initially, but obviously, if we're going to talk about them, we need to. I need to have a name. Or Necreum guy and Utera guy doesn't sound very awesome. But anyways, they're very cool characters, and I love the. I played a Dark Elf army after I played a Dogs of War army. The Dogs of War were amazing for Warhammer Fantasy.
Yeah.
And Malice was really cool, and I know this armor well. I've painted it 1,000 times. Yeah, I think they're really cool, and I love that they ended up mirroring each other. They just it's really cool. I didn't know about the Green Knight though. I think you sent me a picture of. You sent me like. Imagery of the miniature for the Green Knight, but I didn't know that specifically that was the character that you very much liked from Warhammer.
Yeah, I mean, I never played Bretonnians, but the idea of the character from Utera, like I drew and like that, like clicked for me. I always liked the concept of the Green Knight, and the part of it. I played a lot of Chaos and Dark Elves, so like Malice. You're talking about Dogs of War, the Mangles, Skin Flayers, or whatever they were called at the time, Manflayers. Like, it was one of my favorite units to play with in my armies. So, but yeah, I
actually skipped my prom to go to a Warhammer tournament.
Nice.
It was totally worth it.
There you go.
We had a giant Dogs of War army. And they were amazing. They had the rules for them were in White Dwarf. Not to get too off topic, but the rules for them were in White Dwarf, and so no one at any tournaments had them. And we brought them and like cleaned house with them because no one had ever fought them before, so no one had any idea what to do.
Yeah, I dropped those Dark Elf unit of Dog of War on there. The field. People were like, what is that?
Yeah. Well, they had a mobile cannon. They had like a Napoleonic cannon. It was crazy.
It's nasty. Yeah.
Anyways, I love all that stuff. It's really fun. I love miniatures games. Just sitting around painting is like meditation for me. Although I haven't been able to do it recently, but I do love it. But so I was very familiar with this army and the, now that you say it, the Green Knight armor. For that character, it was always a really cool miniature too.
Yeah.
We'll definitely have to get back to you on the names. I absolutely love that idea. But that kind of leads me into another question, and I'm gonna, I guess, wrap this up with some of the things you said before to see if I kind of have this right. So these cards are going to get created. That doesn't necessarily mean they have a solidified place in the lore, because they have to make a presence known in someone's perspective in the story to have their story said or told. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, that's the idea, right? They need to make a statement in the world, and then they'll start to appear. I think that there will be a great opportunity for this coming up, which is not only the digital app. There's some interesting ways that'll fit in there, but we have at the last event, a number of people approached me about wanting to play in storyline events at their local area, like a local community or whatever, and how that was going to work. And we had, like, a year ago, we had done something like that on a large scale, but Fletch and Alex and I got together, and we created a guide for Forge Guardians. To basically, what it will have is one story per faction that can be run at a local, with a local community, and it will have its own storyline rules, just like normal, except for you won't need any like promo cards to do it. We designed it so that it would be all stuff that where you could like write it on a whiteboard or print out some of the cool assets that we created for each particular event. But there'll be 4 different stories, and each of these stories take place outside of the Forge, outside of the main story of the Forgeborn. So you'll get a lot more of a view of what's happening in the rest of the world while the Forgeborn are off doing their thing. Right? So like what are the ripple effects of what the Forgeborn are doing in the world? And so that's what these events will be. And we will collect over a several month period, we'll collect the information we get from people who've run these events on which side of a particular story won, like what cool things happened in that story. But one of the main things I ask people to do with these particular events are, imagine your Forgeborn that you're playing with in that game is only representative of a character that you're playing. So you're not actually playing a Forgeborn in one of these kind of Forge Guardian events. You're playing a character that has powers, and you can imagine them in the ways that you want to imagine them based on the Forgeborn you choose to represent your character. But I'd like people to think of it as like playing a character in a large, like a massive role-playing game. And when you're playing in those tournaments, or these not tournaments, but these storyline events, you're participating in the lore in a more specific way, because you develop the character that you're playing with, and like how their powers manifest in that story, and they're going to be just like the story events that you've played in at tournaments, at conventions and stuff. However, they'll be on a smaller scale, and they'll take place in more specific situations. So, for example, one of them will tell a little bit more of the story of Nyx and Circe, and like what are the things that are going on in the undead kingdom regarding Nyx and Circe. Another one looks a little bit more at what's going on with the Tempests and the North, and their kind of nomadic way of living, and some of the dangers they have to face with the coming, as you see here, the last winter. Like, how does that change their existence, and what kinds of things are they facing? For the Aloyan, we have a story called the Iron Cult, which is that Ironbeard's kind of this enigmatic character who goes off on these crazy adventures and comes back like 50 years later, right? And then like kind of like sits in solitude, like kind of meditating, being his stoic guy. And so over that time, us mere mortals develop stories about who these people are. And so a particular cult has decided that they are obsessed with the Ironbeard, the version of him that they perceive as this like war god. And so they believe that like sending people on forcing people to go on pilgrimage to the Soul Forge will provide them with more Forgeborn. But of course, most people who go on that pilgrimage die. And so there's a question of like which is it fun for you to imagine the Iron Cult becoming a more powerful thing in the world? If so, you get to play as an Iron Cultist. If not, and also just because we're Stoneblade and cultists were a famous part of Ascension, it's fun to add cultists into this as well. So the Iron Cultists are essentially like, or you could play against them, and you're like, part of the Aloyan faction who wants to dismantle this cult that they believe are terrifying. And so within that storyline, depending on the events of what happens, for all the different groups that run it. We have a form that people will fill out, much like the one that you filled out for the character art, and we'll collect that information, and it will shape the future of some of the cards that you see, some of the art that you see, some of the mechanics that you see potentially down the road, some of the events, the larger events that happen at the bigger conventions and stuff like that. So these are kind of smaller ways that you can get, and the Utera have one too. It's based on the Tuscari. The Tuscari are the names for the elephant people.
I do like the War Tusk. Big fan.
Yeah, so the War Tusk, I imagine, is like a class of Tuscari. They're like the paladin of Tuscari people.
Okay. I think these smaller events with direct story impact at a smaller scale, but more pertinent to the faction, sounds very exciting. And from what it sounds like, I mean, you guys heard it here first. Use Necrium guy and Utera guy, not yet named here. When you get your chance, use them in these events so we can get them into the story, see what they do, see what you want them to do. I absolutely love hearing more about these Iron Cultists and these Tuscari and just fleshing out these stories.
I mean, me too. I like see them all the time and go, man, I really want to know more. I wish someone would like tell me about them.
I mean, this Saloran Cultists sound good. You throw enough bodies at it, eventually some of those are going to become Forgeborn.
I know, but that's terrifying on how many people they would end up throwing at it. Which, I don't know. There's interesting. I like the idea of the Circe story with Nyx, because we only saw a glimmer of that so far. Mm-hmm. So now, like, what is Circe doing now that she knows that there's a rebellion like growing within her kingdom? And like, what is Nyx doing now that they're in control of? Now that they're like known as a rebel and potentially a rebel faction within the Necrium kingdom. Because I wouldn't want to be on Circe's bad side. And then I mean the Tempests are fascinating, and I think there's a lot more to be explored there. I certainly like the course that Sunder has gone on since our first event. Shocking to me. I couldn't believe the way that Sunder's storyline went. It was so different than, because I have in my head when we first created the characters, I had like ideas of where they might go, but I also knew that I didn't want to hold too hard onto them because I wanted to see where things went, and I absolutely love where it went, but I totally didn't expect it to go there.
Which is really interesting because, like, I mean, as you read her stories from like the way you've written them, or you and your team have written them, like it just coherently makes sense. Like from the first time you've seen her, like being aggressive and like trying to set her dominance with Korok, like always looking for a way to be like a little bit better, and that can lead you off of this slope. And so it's just really interesting, that storyline. I can't wait to hear more, like what's going to come with it.
Yeah, and Circe getting the Forge, like having the Forge shift to Necrium, was super interesting to me. Mm-hmm. Just super interesting to me. I like the idea of an undead civilization is so fascinating to me. I mean, they all are. I love the non-mounted nomadic people of the of the Icelands. Like the Tempests are amazing. We have this really long story we wrote that will probably be like, it was just like a conceptual story that my friend, who's the anthropologist, and I wrote when we were like kind of trying to figure out the Tempests. And it's cool. It's detached from where the Tempests have gone in the story now, so it's kind of irrelevant. But there's so much stuff in it that I like that we wrote, that one day I hope I can incorporate them into some of these these kind of Forge Guardian lore events, because I think we came up with some really fun stuff, and I do get to at least plant the seeds of story in some of the ways like that.
Well, I love that we've gotten to talk about each faction, and I can't wait to see where these factions go, and they're all special in their own way, without a doubt. You did bring something that we kind of teased at the beginning of this episode, George. If you could kind of give an introduction on what we're about to show here.
Yeah, so this is the short animated video of the last winter, kind of a trailer for the upcoming set and for the upcoming Kickstarter. Yeah, I'll just let you play it. Let's do it.
All right, so here's the animated trailer.
The world is emerging from its glacial tomb. As the ice yields, ancient powers awaken. The other Forgeborn march to claim our land. Desperate for resources, desperate for warmth. But I, Circe, the dead queen, will deny them. With a newfound power under my command, I will turn their cities to ash, blight their precious forests, and infect their very souls. The Soul Forge lights our path to victory. Their factions will know only violence and death. So, let the Forgeborn come. As the last winter descends, my war for solace begins.
Ooh. So, I gotta say, I'm a big fan of where this is going, George. I like one of the lines she used in there, that I will blight their forests and infect their souls. But I will say, there was a big part of me that was hoping Circe wouldn't succumb to the blight, and she would kind of be this, like, the stoic protector. But that wording seemed very particular. So it'll be interesting.
Well, so from everything that's been written about Circe, Circe has developed the image that she is in full control all the time of everything, no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
So whether or not, like, Circe is being infected and like somehow manipulated by the blight or not, she's gonna play it off like she's not.
Sure.
So she's either totally in control and we're not messing around, and she's totally in control, or she's potentially not in control and just is so good at playing the role of, like, I'm all powerful, like I'm as close to omnipotent as you could possibly imagine. That it's like that it could be either way, right? Because again, we're seeing it from Circe's perspective, and we know what Circe wants people to think.
Yeah, I mean, any good dictator knows that as soon as you show a sign of weakness or cracks, that's when they're gonna pounce, and they're gonna get you in the back with 19 knives outside the Parthenon or whatever it may be. So yeah, I agree. Circe's got to play it off either way if that's what's going on.
It's also who's she giving the speech to? She's saying it out loud, so she's saying it to someone, right? Again, like, try and think of all of the lore we have as, like, from the point of view of the character. Sometimes we write it in third person, and but generally the idea is it's not an omnipotent third person. I think there's so continue. Feel free to ask any questions you want about it, because there's reasons for everything.
Well, I think this video is going to be released to the public very, very soon. I am going to watch this video 8, 9, 10 more times to kind of pick apart the lines and kind of see where I go. But Greg, did you have any thoughts coming out of that?
No, I mean, I think I'm with you. I want to watch this a few more times and dig into it. The transitions were really awesome. It was great seeing the cards there, and then the switch over to the Necreum Forge. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is from Circe's point of view because Circe won the Forge at the last event. That's why it was chosen.
Yeah.
I was if Sunder had won or the Forged Stayed Tempest, it would have been another Tempest video. If the Utera had won, it would have been an Utera video. But I was like, in my head, I was like, I'm going to make it from the point of view of whoever has the Forge next, because I feel like they're going to feel like they have the ability. I think the Forge, as much power as it has, also represents to people at this point now the fact that it's like changed shape from the initial form that it had for so long, is the idea that it is also like an indicator of it also is an indicator that they have the ability to like shape the world in whatever fashion they want. Whether it actually means that or not is one thing, but the just seeing the monolith, the icon of the whole world shift and become your flag is symbolic to everyone within each of those factions, right? In whatever way they choose to interpret it, and then hand out that interpretation. So I think there's some fun stuff there, but the White Fang Pass and seeing the world, and that Circe's like, oh, stuff's starting to thaw, they're gonna come for our stuff. Like
Mm-hmm.
like the world is frozen, it's made of ice, it's the best place, it's like uninhabitable unless you live in like the small Aloyan cities, which are like, I imagine they take a tremendous amount of resources to keep functioning, and like the ability to like get enough food to support like a civilization that needs it, and like dealing with the fact that you might be creating more robots than like the people there, or all of these potential like kind of interesting concepts that can come out of the idea of like this hyper technological civilization that lives in these small cities, and then the Tempest, who kind of like rove around in the north, and not just the north but everywhere. But I think like as far as like a grand massive imperial kind of civilization goes, I think that Circe believes that this is our world. The dead survive here better than anywhere, or don't survive, but the dead exist here better than everyone else.
Right, easy to control the landscape when it's dead don't need the sustenance of the living. Two things from that video that I did want to just mention, like the quality was phenomenal. The way that like the art of the certain cards or the Forgeborn like layered in with different animations, and then the voice acting was absolutely supreme. That was super cool. Almost gave me a chill.
Yeah, Lonnie Manila. I think I'm saying her name right. If I'm not, I apologize. I should have asked. We've only communicated through email, but Lonnie has like been doing voices for a million years, and she was the voice of Ivy from Soul Calibur, which I didn't find out till after we started working with her.
Oh, we love that game.
Oh my God, I played so much Soul Calibur. Oh my God, I can't even describe it. Like all of college was Soul Calibur for me. On Dreamcast. So that doesn't age me. But awesome. It was so good. But anyways, yeah, I found that out and I was like, oh, that's amazing. But Lonnie's incredible and was really fun to work with. Did really cool work, and I think really gave a lot of character to Circe.
Well, I think that we're just about close to wrapping up here, George. Do you have any parting words or things that you'd like to share with our viewers or the community before we step out here?
I mean, one, definitely follow the Kickstarter. There's going to be some really cool stuff coming up on that. Working on some of the cool stretch goals that we have, and some of the things that are going to be coming out of that Kickstarter and the digital app. I mean, I can't even begin to say like where that could potentially take the story, because just the amount of players that could potentially be on it, the amount of players that could be interacting with the story, the ability to like have online tournaments, which essentially could be story focused, could bring a lot more people to it. I mean, I have all sorts of things in my head that I imagine, but I don't want to say them out loud until I can make that kind of stuff a reality, because my imagination will go crazy and start coming up with, I'm like, the computers are involved, what can we do? Like
yeah, the metrics that could come out of it.
Yeah, it's super exciting. And then on the other side of it, I would say the Forge Guardian lore events. Like, if you get a chance to join them, if you really like the lore part of it, I think they're going to be really cool and fun. And I think you're going to see some really interesting stuff from it. One of the things that'll happen that we have planned is that if you run one of those lore events, what we will do is send promo cards for the people who played in it that are based on the victory condition that you met in that game. So not everyone will get the same cards, right?
Interesting.
So the idea is that they're kind of like a new kind of minion. They're not mechanically new, but they're minions that don't necessarily show a creature. They more show a story event. They're more just to like say, I participated in this story event. I'm going to use this minion for this thing.
That's very cool.
Right.
Nice.
It's just like another way to use minions, we thought, like, and a really interesting way to like support, like the fact that you are participated in a piece of history of the world, right? Because the idea is that you won't always be running the same storyline events. You would essentially create a new set of them after X amount of months, and then like there would be like new story stuff to access. So I think it'll be really, really fun. And from as a person who just loves digging into the story and playing around in the story and seeing how people interact with it, I'm just really excited about both this and where the app where the digital Soul Forge can take everything. So yeah, that's it. Yeah, follow the Kickstarter and get into one of those events when you can. We haven't sent them out to Forge Guardians yet, but we will. It's all done. I just have to give it to Alex to send.
Well, George, I did want to say thank you so much for obviously taking the time to be on here with us, but then also just for being as invested as you are in this world and everything you've kind of brought with and have given us to do. So thank you.
Oh, no problem. Thank you so much for having me. It's really fun. Anytime. I love talking about this stuff and theorizing about the world that I'm also theorizing about.
All right. With that being said, this is going to wrap up our episode. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in today, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for attending this lesson of the Forgeborn Finishing School. If you like this video, please subscribe, comment, or consider donating to our Patreon account. We look forward to our next lesson.